Welcome to the Morrison Report. Hosted by Deval Morrison, sales representative for Bosley Real Estate Limited Brokerage. Ms. Morrison has co-authored the best-selling book, Success Today, with Brian Tracy, and has been interviewed on NBC, ABC, and CBS affiliates by Bob Guinea from The Bachelor. Deval, a real estate investor, has spoken to many attendees at her real estate seminars and is currently ranked in the top 5% of agents in her brokerage. Join me in welcoming your host, Deval Morrison.
Welcome to the Morrison Report. I wanted to create a podcast that would give people insights into the Toronto real estate market. You can follow me on Twitter at Deval Morrison and on Instagram as Deval Morrison. And you can like my business page on Facebook.
Thanks everyone for joining me today on the Morrison Report. I have with me today Joe Sammet, who is a mortgage broker. And Joe, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and where you work?
Hi, Deval. Thanks very much. My name is Joe Sammet, and I am a broker with Mortgage Architects. I was one of the founding partners of Mortgage Architects 10 years ago, and we've built it into what today is considered to be one of the largest brokerages in Canada.
Awesome. That sounds great. So today we really wanted to talk to Joe about what in the world is going on with the new mortgage rules, and what does that mean for people. So where do you want to start, Joe? Because there's so much.
But the question is so precise. What in the world is going on in the mortgage market and the real estate market? Because since the announcement came out 2 weeks ago, what I can say is that there's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of untruths, and there are a lot of people that are trying to make themselves sound perhaps smart or be the first ones out with information. And unfortunately, a lot of the information is either coming out incorrectly or it's being misconstrued by the listeners. But there's a lot going on, and it's primarily designed to perhaps not necessarily cave the market or crash the market. It's designed to perhaps slow it down, keep it calm, level things off, because things are growing at quite a rapid rate.
Got it. Okay. So what's the first thing that you would say the first change that buyers will notice with the new mortgage rules?
The biggest change that came out was that all mortgages let's assume all purchasers with less than 20% down have to now qualify under what they call the Bank of Canada benchmark rate, or otherwise referred to as the stress test. And that qualification rate is today 4.74. And basically what that's saying is that we will be able to give you a rate of, let's call it 2.44, but for safety purposes, we want to, and have to now, as of Monday the 17th, we have to now qualify you using a rate of 4.74. And it's really, it's primarily designed to show that people can meet that stress test and can withstand any upheaval in rates. It's really being designed to make sure that all parties are protected, most importantly the consumer, because we would hate to see people getting in at a rate of 2.4 and then having rates jump to 4% and then not be able to afford the same house that they just purchased.
Right, of course.
So, and let me preface that by saying I'm not saying rates are going up. I'm just saying that, again, stress tests are designed to make sure that they can withstand any upheaval in rates if, in fact, it were to take place. So where that differs from the old rule is that prior to Monday, you could have purchased a home, had less than 20% down, and chose a 5-year term and have qualified on the 2.4 rate. Now you can't. Now you have to qualify on the benchmark, which again is 4.74.
Wow.
That rule was reserved previously to any term other than a 5-year term. So if somebody was taking a variable mortgage, a 1, 2, 3, 4-year term, they had to meet the stress test by using the Bank of Canada benchmark. It was 5-year buyers or 5-year borrowers that were more or less kept out of that ruling. Now they're all part and parcel with the same thing. They all have to meet that stress test, regardless of what term you choose.
Wow. So now what about, is there an element of the stress test that has to do with debt servicing and percentage of debt servicing?
Yes. If you have an individual will qualify on what is called the GDS and a TDS ratio. If your credit score is greater than 680, you can qualify with a GDS ratio of 39 and a TDS ratio of 44. And maybe we should plan another podcast to discuss that.
Yeah, because I would say, back up for a second. I thought that you had to have a minimum credit score of 600. You're saying it's got to be 680?
You have to have a minimum credit score of 600 just to qualify for a bank mortgage.
Got it. Okay.
But in order to qualify for those higher qualifying ratios, you need to have a Beacon score of greater than 680.
Wow.
Okay. So what that's saying is that, and let's just look at it right from the bottom up, if you had a Beacon score of 610, you would have to meet qualifying ratios of a GDS of 35 and a TDS of 42.
So 35%, you're going to highlight for us what, and you're saying 35, you mean 35%, right?
35%, that's right.
And
right.
Can you tell us what is in that 35%?
What that means, or what that takes into consideration, is that you are allowed to use up to 35% of your income to service the debt of the house that you're buying, or of the property that you're buying. So taking into consideration the mortgage cost, a heat component, property taxes, maintenance fees if it's a condo, again, you're allowed to use up to 35% of your income if your Beacon score is less than 680.
Okay.
If your credit Beacon score is greater than 680, you are eligible to use up to, or allowed to use up to 39% of your income to service that debt.
Wow. So the difference essentially is 35% or 39%, depending on what your credit score is.
Precisely. And
wow.
Then the second qualifying ratio is a TDS ratio, which stands for total debt service ratio. That states that you're allowed to use up to 44% of your income if your qualifying ratio, or pardon me, if your Beacon score is greater than 680. If your Beacon score is less than 680, you have to stick within 42% of your income. And what a TDS ratio is taking into consideration the carrying cost of the property you're buying.
Mm-hmm.
So all of those functions I discussed earlier, plus all of your outside debt. So if you have car loans, lines of credit, credit cards, we have to incorporate that into your total debt service ratio. And again, you're only allowed to use up to 42% of your income or 44% of your income if your credit's good enough to service that debt.
Wow. So where should we start? Let's go to, so if let's say before you were qualified to spend $650,000 at a mortgage, does that mean now you're only qualified for $500,000 of a mortgage, around there?
We have to run the specific numbers because, as I mentioned, some of the numbers that come to consideration would be property taxes,
right,
maintenance fees, and then all of the outside debt. So a $650,000 buyer 2 weeks ago may be somewhere today between $550 and $575, depending on a couple of other factors. But I just worked on one just yesterday where an individual 2 weeks ago was approved for $450, and they are now qualified for $375. So from that standpoint, they were affected, but at the same time, it perhaps got them to a point where they're looking at a more realistic acquisition, something that is not going to stretch them too far, and they know full well that they've got the safety in place to make sure that if there was a bump in rates, that they'd be able to afford the same property.
Wow.
So
it sounds
affordability
like,
is effective.
Yeah, it sounds like they've created more of a competition in the condo market now, because if I think of someone who is, let's say, able to spend $650 on a house before, and now they're kicked down to $575, well, now they're really into the condo market and they really can't get a house. And that person who was, I think you said $450 before, and they're now down to $375, they're looking at a one-bedroom condo, but still it'll be tricky to find that.
It could be, or keep in mind that if they were looking at a house at the 650 mark and now their qualifying ratios are being impeded by these new rules and they are moving down to, or moving over into a condo market, you now have to take into consideration a maintenance fee that you didn't have on the house.
Right.
So depending on that, factoring into the TDS ratio, or pardon me, the GDS and the TDS ratio,
right.
That could, we don't know yet how that's going to impact people. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of calculations that have to come to play in order to figure out how much somebody's going to qualify for and how this is in fact going to impact them. The individual I was referring to yesterday, or that I dealt with yesterday, they were originally a $450 condo.
Mm-hmm.
If they had stayed in the condo market, they would have been reduced to, again, $360, maybe $375. But if they move to a house where they don't now have a maintenance fee, they can bump their purchase price up to $425.
Right.
So, like I say, there's a lot of moving parts when calculating the GDS and TDS rule or ratios, and it's not a steadfast or a set fast rule where somebody is going to qualify for, say, 25% less today than they did 2 weeks ago. And that, I think, is where the media is perhaps relaying the information quite irresponsibly, because they're coming across letting everybody believe that the sky is falling and that They're not going to qualify for what they used to qualify, and it's going to be a dramatic shift. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the case.
But it's funny because the way that you describe it to me, I'm thinking the sky is falling. And if I were one of those people who's been kicked down to those numbers, I just think that they've taken home ownership away from some of the first-time home buyers now, because all they really could afford is a condo, and a small condo at that.
On that note, I agree to a certain extent. The reason I say that is because there were, and there have been for many, many years now, a certain segment of the population that are buying that perhaps shouldn't have been buying. And the reason they shouldn't have been buying is because they can't withstand that upheaval in rates. And again, not saying that rates are going anywhere, but in the event they did, and these people qualified just by a hair based on using, let's say, a 2.4% 5-year rate in the past,
right,
they can find themselves in a lot of trouble when it comes to refinancing or perhaps selling the property and getting themselves out of a situation that they then can't afford. So what this new rule is going to do, it most certainly will impact a certain segment of the population, but it's not as widespread as the media is reporting it to be. It's going to be, in my opinion, a very small percentage of the population that might now be squeezed completely out of the marketplace.
Yeah,
but it's a select, and not to sound as though it's being targeted, but it is perhaps a segment of the buying population that might want to reconsider that decision to buy because they could be biting off more than they can chew if there's a change in the market.
I mean, I guess I look at, the default rates in general in Canada, and it seems to me that the default rates for mortgages aren't really that high. What would you say the default rates are like?
0.01%. They're non-existent. The default rates are very, very low.
So it seems like the government's fixing a problem that we don't actually have.
And the jury's still out on that, because what's going to happen is by these changes that have gone into effect, as I say, a certain segment of the population is going to be affected. It's going to make another segment of the population a lot stronger, perhaps. It's going to make the qualified buyers or individuals that have already been qualified because their income is good, their credit is good, and they're living within those ratios, it's going to make them even stronger going forward, whereas you're absolutely right. That smaller segment of the population could very well be squeezed out. But this is going to have it's going to have a trickle-down effect in a number of different areas. It could very well level off house prices. It could perhaps even see the reduction in some house prices or property prices. It could very well also amount to a small increase in rates. And the reason for that is because of the conventional business. So forget about the high ratio stuff that we've just been talking about.
Right.
But the conventional business, so people that have 20% down or more, some of those mortgage portfolios are insured through CMHC, Genworth, and Canada Guarantee in the background. And the cost of those funds are going to become more expensive because the insurers are no longer wanting to insure or bulk insure conventional portfolios. So lenders are having to pass some of that cost over to the borrower. So it could very well raise rates somewhat, but again, not to a level that's going to be cost prohibitive or earth shattering. Again, let's not forget that we're at a historical low interest rate marketplace with rates right now as low as 2.39, 2.44. Right. These are absolutely the lowest rates in Canadian mortgage history. We have house prices that are at right now the highest they've been because they just continue to climb. Mm-hmm. So this is going to see, I believe the effect of this is going to cause some sort of a leveling off in the marketplace, a resettling, for perhaps lack of a better word, whereby we're going to be able to sit back and assess what people are buying, why they're buying it, and how they're going to be able to afford it. So these changes, I do embrace them. The one thing that is very disheartening for myself and a number of people in our industry is that there's so much miscommunication and so much misinformation. There are people out there, individuals that have no concern whatsoever from an affordability standpoint, but they're already panicking, wondering what's going to happen with their mortgage when it matures next year.
Interesting.
The phone calls that we're feeling are very, very interesting because there are people that are frightened just based on what they're hearing and or how they're interpreting the information. And one thing that's happened this week is that a new date has been set, and that is November the 30th,
right,
which is another date that the banks have more or less come out and said, or the finance department has come out and said, we're going to revisit this one change, and we will let everybody know what we're going to be doing come November the 30th. And what that would pertain to, or what that's going to include, would be conventional mortgages.
So you're talking about people who are putting